Before gold poured from Mexico or silver flowed from Peru, Spain's empire was born on smaller, bloodier islands. The Caribbean wasn't a paradise. It was a laboratory of conquest, slavery, and survival. What began here would echo through centuries of colonial domination. In 1492, after weeks of uncertain navigation across the Atlantic, 3 Spanish ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, finally made landfall on a small island in the Bahamas. The man leading this voyage, Christopher Columbus, believed he had reached the Indies. What he had actually found was a gateway to a hemisphere unknown to Europe, a world that would soon be forever changed. The first encounters with the Taíno people were deceptively peaceful. The Taíno greeted the strange newcomers with curiosity, hospitality, and gifts. They wore little clothing, lived in structured societies, and shared food and resources freely among themselves. To Columbus, they seemed gentle, naive, and ripe for Christian conversion or exploitation. He noted in his journal that they would make good servants. These early impressions foreshadowed the dark transformation about to unfold. The Spanish crew was dazzled by the lush, tropical environment: coconut palms, exotic birds, golden sands. But their eyes were fixed on one thing: gold. In every meeting with native islanders, Columbus asked about sources of precious metals. He heard rumors of gold-rich islands to the south and west, and he interpreted them not as myth, but as a map to imperial fortune. By the time Columbus reached Hispaniola, the island now divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic, he had resolved to stake a permanent Spanish claim. With the wreck of the Santa Maria, he built a small garrison called La Navidad, leaving behind a few dozen men while he sailed back to Spain to report success. He promised Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand that the lands were fertile, the people friendly, and the potential for wealth enormous. But this initial contact was not just the dawn of discovery, it was the first act in a violent and irreversible drama. While Columbus was hailed as a hero in Spain, the seeds of empire, enslavement, and genocide had already been planted in the soil of the Caribbean. La Navidad, the first European settlement in the New World, would not survive Columbus's return. The indigenous Taino, confused and enraged by the cruelty of the Spaniards left behind, would rise against them. These early days of wonder, exchange, and uneasy peace would not last. What began as exploration quickly evolved into colonization, and the Caribbean, with its rich ecosystems and complex indigenous societies, would become the proving ground for a brutal new world order. The age of exploration had arrived. But for the people of the Caribbean, it would soon become the age of destruction. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola in 1493, he brought with him 17 ships, over 1,000 settlers, priests, artisans, and soldiers. This was no longer an exploratory mission. It was the formal beginning of Spain's colonial experiment. Hispaniola was to be the heart of a new empire. But what the Spanish envisioned as a utopia of riches and Christian triumph quickly began to rot from within. Upon arrival, Columbus discovered La Navidad, the small fort he had left behind, in ruins. The men he stationed there had been killed by the Taíno. According to native accounts, the Spanish had abused the local people, stolen food, taken women, and violated the fragile peace. In retaliation, the Taíno rose. This shocked the Spanish crown, but did not slow their ambition. In its place, Columbus established Santo Domingo, the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. From the beginning, the colony was plagued by chaos. Many settlers, lured by promises of wealth, were unprepared for the harsh realities of building a colony from scratch. Food ran short, disease spread, some settlers mutinied. Others turned their frustration into violence against the indigenous population. To enforce order and profit, Columbus initiated a brutal system called the encomienda. Under this system, Spanish colonists were granted control over native communities, using their labor in exchange for Christian instruction and education. In practice, it was slavery. Taino men were forced into gold mines or fields, while women were taken into households, often as servants. Or worse, the strain on the indigenous population was immediate and devastating. Within a decade, tens of thousands of Taino had died from overwork, starvation, or European diseases for which they had no immunity. Some resisted by fleeing to the mountains. Others chose suicide over captivity. Entire villages vanished in silence. As the colony faltered, Columbus's authority began to crumble. Reports reached Spain of mismanagement, cruelty, and rebellion among the settlers. By 1500, Columbus was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though he was later released, he never returned to govern again. But the damage was done to both the people and the land. Hispaniola became the template for future conquest, extract resources, enslave the population, and suppress resistance. The island that once symbolized promise and paradise had become a graveyard of broken ideals. Yet, in Spain's eyes, Hispaniola was a success. Gold shipments trickled into Seville. The church established its first foothold in the New World, and the Spanish crown realized something terrifyingly simple. Conquest worked. The Caribbean, once full of wonder and mystery, was now a laboratory for empire. And as Hispaniola cracked under the weight of its own brutality, Spain looked outward, to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to the shores of Mexico. Dreaming of greater riches, bigger kingdoms, and more absolute control. By the early 1500s, Hispaniola had proven two things to the Spanish crown. One, that vast territories in the New World could be claimed and held, and two, that even paradise could be bled dry. As the island buckled under depopulation, rebellion, and disease, Spain set its eyes on the surrounding lands, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. These islands would become the following proving grounds for conquest. The island of Puerto Rico, or San Juan Bautista as the Spanish named it, was colonized in 1508 under Juan Ponce de Leon, a former lieutenant of Columbus. With lessons learned from Hispaniola, Spain moved swiftly and strategically. Forts were built, settlements established, and the encomienda system once again implemented. Indigenous Taino communities were conscripted into forced labor. Within 2 decades, much of the island's native population was gone, claimed by overwork, disease, and resistance met with brutal force. Across the sea, the island of Cuba, the largest in the Caribbean, attracted special interest. Rich in resources and strategically positioned, it was seen as a potential launching point for further exploration. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuéllar led the conquest of Cuba, employing a combination of force and diplomacy. Some indigenous leaders tried to resist, including Hatuey, a Taino chief who had fled the violence in Hispaniola. He famously warned his people that the Spaniards worshipped gold above all else. Captured and burned alive, Hatuey is remembered today as Cuba's first national hero. But such resistance was rare and short-lived. By the mid-1510s, Spanish settlements like Havana and Santiago de Cuba had been established. Sugarcane was introduced, mines were opened, and enslaved labor, first indigenous and later African, became the foundation of the island's economy. Spanish governors acted with near total autonomy, wielding both crown authority and personal ambition. Jamaica, seized in 1509, followed a similar pattern. Initially valued more for its location than its resources, it became a strategic port and restocking site for ships heading to and from Spain. The indigenous Arawak people were quickly overwhelmed, and like elsewhere, the population collapsed within decades. But these expansions were not merely acts of empire building. They were rehearsals. Spain was testing the mechanisms of colonial rule, how to extract wealth, enforce control, and suppress resistance. Soldiers became governors. Priests became cultural engineers. Gold, sugar, and labor were extracted with ruthless efficiency. And when native populations could no longer sustain the demands of the economy, Spain began importing enslaved Africans in increasing numbers. This rapid spread of colonization across the Caribbean formed the backbone of what would soon become New Spain. These islands became staging grounds for even grander ambitions, including the invasions of Mexico and Peru. By the 1520s, the Caribbean was no longer a land of wonder. It was a machine of conquest, faith, and commerce. And the islands Spain once used as stepping stones would become blood-soaked foundations of an empire stretching across the Americas. In the wake of conquistadors came a different kind of army, one armed not with swords, but with crucifixes. As the Spanish Empire expanded across the Caribbean in the early 1500s, the Catholic Church followed closely behind, tasked with a divine mission to save souls. But the cross and the crown were never far apart. What was framed as a spiritual conquest became another tool of imperial domination. Missionaries from powerful religious orders, the Franciscans, Dominicans, and later the Jesuits, arrived in large numbers by ship. They were scholars, priests, linguists, and idealists, determined to convert the heathens of the New World to Christianity. To the Spanish crown, this wasn't just a pious duty, it was justification. In the eyes of Europe, colonization was moral if it meant saving souls. The reality on the ground, however, was more complex and often far darker. In places like Puerto Rico and Cuba, missionaries baptized entire villages en masse, often under the threat of force or death. Indigenous spiritual systems were declared demonic. Sacred sites were desecrated, temples were razed, and in their place, churches rose like monuments of conquest. Many Taíno and Arawak people accepted conversion, sometimes sincerely, sometimes as a survival strategy. But even baptism couldn't shield them from forced labor or violence. The church's role in the encomienda system, where colonists received native labor in exchange for promises of religious instruction, became deeply controversial. While some clergy looked away, others became vocal critics. Among them was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had once owned encomiendas himself. He underwent a transformation, horrified by the brutality he witnessed. Las Casas became one of the first and loudest voices to condemn Spanish cruelty. In his A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, he detailed atrocities committed against indigenous peoples and begged the crown to reform its policies. His pleas sparked debate back in Spain, but change came slowly, if at all. Still, the church was not a monolithic entity. While some priests acted as tools of colonial control, others built schools, wrote grammars of native languages, and preserved pieces of indigenous culture, even as they sought to replace them. Some taught literacy, baptized infants, and argued, sometimes successfully, for better treatment of native peoples. However, the church continued to operate in the shadow of the empire. Conversion was tied to obedience. Baptism meant entering a new world order, one ruled by Spain, guided by Catholicism, and powered by gold and labor. Indigenous beliefs were not merely displaced, they were criminalized. By the mid-1500s, the Caribbean's religious landscape had undergone significant changes. Nearly all native populations were officially Christianized, though what that meant varied widely. In practice, many communities merged old beliefs with new rituals, creating syncretic faiths that hid old gods beneath the names and traditional ceremonies beneath the Mass. What emerged was not spiritual salvation alone, but a religious system that mirrored Spain's colonial machine, rigid, hierarchical, and deeply entangled with power. And this system would not stop at the islands. It was the blueprint for all of Spanish America. They arrived invisible, aboard ships packed with men and steel, unseen, uninvited, and unstoppable. Long before the bullets and crosses, it was disease that brought the Caribbean to its knees. With the first European landings came a microbial invasion that would do more damage than any army. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Each pathogen spread like wildfire across island chains where populations had no previous exposure and no immunity. For the Taíno, Arawak, and Carib peoples who called these lands home, the consequences were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but some scholars believe that within 50 years of Columbus's first voyage, over 90% of the Caribbean's native population had died. Entire villages vanished without violence. Chiefs and elders succumbed in days. Social structures collapsed. Oral traditions evaporated. The rhythm of life, farming, fishing, storytelling, ritual, fell silent under the weight of relentless funerals. The diseases didn't need an army to spread. A single infected sailor could potentially spread illness to an entire region. Trade, forced labor, missionary travels, all became unintended networks of death. Spanish chroniclers were horrified and fascinated. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, one of the earliest historians of the Indies, described how smallpox left bodies swollen, faces disfigured, and the living begging for death. Survivors were often blind, scarred, or traumatized. To the Spanish, this destruction seemed like divine validation, a sign that God had chosen their empire to rule. But not all believed this was fate. Some friars and observers, like Las Casas, called it genocide. Not because the disease was introduced deliberately, but because it was allowed to rage unchecked. At the same time, colonial authorities continued to demand tribute, labor, and obedience from those who were dying. In the encomiendas, weakened natives were forced to mine gold and cut timber while fevers raged. The sick were whipped for slowing down. Women miscarried in cane fields. Children died clinging to mothers who had already gone cold. Survivors were left with no community, no leadership, and no choice but to convert or perish. What made the demographic collapse even more profound was its cultural effect. With the elders and spiritual leaders gone, entire belief systems vanished. Stories were lost. Languages faded. Knowledge of navigation, herbal healing, and ceremonies was lost within a single generation. In many parts of the Caribbean, there was no one left even to remember the names of the gods. The Spanish, realizing their labor force was vanishing, began looking elsewhere, toward Africa. But the scars of this collapse ran deep. What had once been a mosaic of vibrant societies became a landscape of silence and ruins, haunted by what might have been. Islands like Hispaniola, once teeming with indigenous life, were emptied of their original inhabitants, and so the Caribbean, Spain's first colonial crucible, became not just a proving ground for empire, but the site of one of history's most devastating population losses. It was not just a conquest, it was erasure. The Caribbean may have been Spain's crown jewel, but it quickly became a target for every rival empire, with an eye for gold and resentment in its blood. By the late 1500s, Spain's monopoly over New World riches, especially the gold and silver pouring out of the Americas, made the Caribbean not just a colony, but a battlefield. What began as exploration turned into open conflict, and the once tranquil waters became a crucible of piracy, privateering, and imperial warfare. At the center of it all was a new kind of soldier, the pirate. But not all pirates were lawless. Many operated with a royal license, known as a letter of marque. These were privateers, legally sanctioned raiders who attacked Spanish ships and settlements on behalf of their own crowns. Men like Francis Drake, celebrated in England and despised in Spain, became legends by raiding Spanish ports such as Santo Domingo and Cartagena, and seizing treasures intended for the Spanish crown. To the Spanish, they were criminals. To the English, they were heroes of resistance. As Spain struggled to patrol its growing empire, France, England, and the Dutch Republic began carving out their own footholds, often by supporting pirates, encouraging contraband trade, and even seizing islands. The Spanish Armada, once unrivaled, found itself overextended. It couldn't be everywhere. Fortresses were built, fleets were dispatched, but the enemy came from within the waves. The Caribbean, once Spain's closed garden, became an open theater of maritime chess. And Spain was no longer the only player. Beyond pirates, tensions were rising in the region's settlements. Indigenous survivors who escaped encomiendas often joined the pirates or rival colonies. Slaves who fled sugar plantations took up arms against their former masters or aided foreign raiders. Islands changed hands, loyalties shifted, and the old world rules no longer applied. Havana, San Juan, and Portobello, once sleepy outposts, were transformed into heavily fortified cities. Cannons lined the coasts. Towers rose over harbors. Watchmen scanned the sea for the dreaded black sails. Spain realized that control over the Caribbean wasn't just about sugar or gold. It was about naval supremacy, and it was slipping away. The warfare was not limited to ships. Religious wars from Europe bled into the Caribbean too. Protestant versus Catholic, French Huguenots versus Spanish Catholics. Faith became yet another reason to burn a port or sack a church. The conquest of souls had turned into a war of swords and gunpowder. By the end of the century, Spain's enemies had discovered something profound. They didn't need to conquer Mexico or Peru to hurt Spain. They just needed to bleed her in the Caribbean. One stolen shipment, one burned sugar field, one ambushed galleon at a time. And so, the Caribbean, once seen as the peaceful stepping stone to mainland riches, became a volatile front line. The waves no longer shimmered with promise. They roared with warning. The age of piracy had begun. By the turn of the 17th century, the Caribbean was no longer just a stopover. It had become a churning engine of European empire. But this engine ran on two things: sugar and gold. And both demanded brutal fuel. The sugarcane plantations of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico expanded in size and organization. Sugar wasn't just a sweet luxury anymore. It was white gold. In the streets of Seville and Lisbon, London and Amsterdam, the taste of sugar-fueled cravings that only the New World could satisfy. But producing sugar was backbreaking. It wasn't enough to grow the cane. It had to be harvested, crushed, boiled, and crystallized. It required massive infrastructure, including mills, boilers, barrels, and all the above: labor. Human labor. At first, the Spanish had relied on enslaved indigenous people, but epidemics, wars, and sheer cruelty decimated those populations. By the late 1500s, the focus had shifted almost entirely to enslaved Africans, brought over the Atlantic in ships that stank of death and despair. Each plantation became a prison. Men, women, and children worked under the sun, lashed by overseers, denied humanity. What was the life expectancy for an enslaved person on a sugar plantation? Less than a decade. And yet, the profits continued to roll in. Sugar became one of the most profitable commodities in the Atlantic world. Caribbean ports swelled with activity. Ships from Europe docked to offload goods and weapons, then reloaded with sugar, tobacco, and sometimes enslaved people for the voyage back. It was a brutal triangle. Africa to the Americas, then back to Europe. A cycle of commerce, conquest, and human misery. But sugar wasn't the only treasure Spain extracted. The Caribbean also served as a collection and dispatch point for gold and silver mined in Mexico and Peru. galleons would depart from Portobello and Havana, their hulls heavy with treasure bound for Seville. These ships, glittering with the wealth of empires, became floating targets for pirates and privateers. To protect them, Spain developed the flota system, heavily armed convoys that moved in fleets. Yet, even with such protection, many ships never reached their home ports. Storms, sabotage, and raiders saw to that. Meanwhile, the European empire looked on with envy. Spain had struck first, but sugar and gold made enemies bold. The Caribbean became a contest of monopolies, where Dutch, French, and English ambitions clashed with Spanish pride. Colonial footholds became fortresses, and every port became a potential battlefield. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control of global trade. Whoever ruled the Caribbean could choke or empower an empire. But behind every crate of sugar and bar of silver was the reality no empire wanted to face. The system was unsustainable. Soil eroded, populations died, enslaved people resisted, and revolts brewed just below the surface. Still, for now, the machine roared. Sweet, bloody, profitable. The Caribbean wasn't just a colony anymore. It was the core of a global economy. And Spain, for now, still held the reins. As Spanish flags were planted across the Caribbean, so too were crosses. To the crown, the expansion of the Spanish Empire was never just about territory or treasure. It was a divine mission, a sacred obligation to bring Christianity to what they called the pagan world. Enter the friars, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, clad in coarse robes, carrying only books and a burning sense of purpose. They sailed across the Atlantic to lands they scarcely understood. Their goal: conversion, salvation, and the spiritual conquest of the New World. But the meeting of faiths was not a peaceful affair. Indigenous belief systems had deep roots: gods of rain, sun, earth, and ancestors. In many Caribbean societies, spirituality was deeply ingrained in daily life, guided by shamans and rituals that had been passed down through generations. To the Spanish, these practices were heresy, devilry, even demonic possession. What followed was often not dialogue, but destruction. Sacred objects were burned, temples were demolished, oral traditions were silenced. In their place rose churches, monasteries, and mission towns, stone symbols of Spain's divine authority. But conversion was rarely clean. Some indigenous communities adopted Christianity on the surface while preserving their spiritual heritage in secret, blending Catholic saints with ancestral gods in what became known as syncretism. This fusion of faiths allowed native identity to survive under the watchful eyes of the colonizers. For enslaved Africans, the collision of their own belief systems with those of their captors was even more complex. Ripped from their homelands, stripped of language, culture, and kin, many were baptized forcibly upon arrival. Yet African spiritual traditions, rooted in Yoruba, Congo, and Dahomey cosmologies, refused to die. In whispered prayers and hidden rituals, enslaved people preserved fragments of their old world, giving birth to hybrid religions like Santeria, Vodou, and Obeah in the Caribbean. These new belief systems were acts of resistance, spiritual rebellion against cultural erasure. Yet not all missionaries saw native or African spirituality as evil. Some documented indigenous customs, learned native languages, and even defended local communities against the worst abuses of encomenderos and colonial officials. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas emerged, friars who spoke out against slavery and argued that indigenous souls were as worthy as any in Europe. But their voices were few and often ignored. In practice, the church became a pillar of colonial power. Baptism became a tool of control. Mass attendance was mandatory. And sins, especially rebellion or refusal to obey, were punished not just by soldiers, but by God's representatives. Religion offered salvation, but demanded surrender. And yet, despite all this, the Caribbean did not become spiritually homogeneous. It became a crucible of faiths, where Catholicism, ancestral spirits, African deities, and New World saints coexisted in uneasy harmony. The Church had hoped to erase old gods. Instead, it found itself changed by them. By the late 1500s, the Caribbean was more than Spain's colonial outpost. It was the nexus of global conflict, a shimmering sea of stolen gold, enslaved people, sugar plantations, and ruthless ambition. And the Spanish weren't the only ones circling the prize. Others were watching. England, France, the Netherlands, all late to the New World, but hungry. And where there was Spanish wealth, there were ships. Where there were ships, there were pirates. But not all pirates were outlaws. Some were corsairs, state-sanctioned privateers wielding royal commissions like swords. In the eyes of their monarchs, they were patriots. In the eyes of Spain, they were thieves. The Caribbean quickly became a battlefield at sea. English corsair Sir Francis Drake famously raided the Spanish Main, sacking ports like Cartagena, Santo Domingo, and St. Augustine. Drake didn't just steal treasure, he humiliated an empire. His attacks exposed how thinly Spain's power stretched across the ocean. The Spanish built fortresses, thick walls of stone at Havana, San Juan, and Veracruz. They armed their treasure fleets with warships and cannons. But it wasn't enough. No fortress could guard every island. No galleon could outrun every storm or ambush. And soon, it wasn't just pirates. European rivals began establishing illegal colonies in the Caribbean. The French claimed Tortuga. The English took hold of Barbados, St. Kitts, and eventually Jamaica. The Dutch carved footholds in Curaçao and Sint Eustatius. Spain's monopoly was crumbling, its imperial dream being dismantled in real time. The violence spread inland. European powers began arming indigenous allies, weaponizing local conflicts for global gain. Spain's enemies weren't just coming by sea. They were now inside the colonies, feeding unrest and inciting rebellion. For enslaved Africans, pirates were both terror and opportunity. Some pirates were enslaved, others were liberated. A few crews welcomed runaway slaves, creating multi-ethnic brotherhoods bound not by race, but by gold and survival. In some stories, pirates offered a strange kind of freedom. Brutal, uncertain, but free from chains. The age of privateers gave way to full-blown naval warfare. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Caribbean was no longer a haven for Spanish treasure fleets. It had become contested waters, where flags changed overnight, and where the line between criminal and conqueror blurred. Spain's empire, once untouchable, now bled from 1,000 cuts. The Caribbean, Spain's first testing ground, had become the front line of a global power struggle. And while Spain still held mighty cities on the mainland, its control over the sea and its vision of sole dominion was slipping fast. The pirates weren't just raiding for gold, they were tearing apart an empire's illusion of invincibility. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Spanish Caribbean had ceased to be an untamed frontier. It was the laboratory of empire, a place where Spain's grand ambitions, brutal strategies, and global rivalries had all been tested and scarred. From the first contact with indigenous peoples to the construction of towering fortresses, the Caribbean had revealed the limits of conquest. Spain had arrived with steel, scripture, and sails, determined to extract gold, souls, and obedience. What it found was resistance, rebellion, and a fragile grip on power. The indigenous Taíno were nearly erased, victims of disease, violence, and forced labor. But their loss would not be forgotten. The myth of peaceful conquest was shattered in the Caribbean, replaced with a legacy of exploitation that echoed across the Americas. The sugar plantations of Hispaniola and Cuba became blueprints, economic engines powered by African slave labor. with human suffering hidden beneath the sweetness of profit. The Caribbean taught Spain how to build wealth in the New World, not through gold alone, but through land, crops, and the brutal commodification of people. In turn, it birthed patterns that would haunt the hemisphere: rigid caste hierarchies, the normalization of slavery, extractive economies that drained land and lives, colonial cities that served the crown but suffocated the colonized. However, despite its early dominance, Spain could not control the future. The Caribbean opened the door to the Atlantic world, a swirling network of trade, war, and migration that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And in that vortex, Spain was no longer alone. The islands Spain once held in solitary splendor became battlefields and bargaining chips. By the late 1500s, England, France, and the Dutch were not just raiding ports. They were planting flags, establishing plantations, and rewriting the rules of empire. The legacy of Spain's Caribbean experiment wasn't just about gold or glory. It was about what happens when empires collide with reality, with disease, with defiance, with pirates, with moral decay, and with their own unrelenting ambition. And yet, the Caribbean had also proven something else: that no colony was truly peripheral. The events on these small islands would ripple outward, shaping the fall of empires, the rise of revolutions, and the long, painful fight for liberation that would come centuries later. The Spanish Caribbean had been the start, the first spark in a long burning fire of colonization and resistance. It was where the empire learned how to rule, and where the world learned how to resist.